The last message came in at 0317, and Senior Enforcement Marshal William Cade didn't answer it fast enough. That was the whole problem, right there. 6 words, a fraction of a second. He'd been fast enough for 41 years, fast enough on the colony platforms of Kepler-7, fast enough in the sulfur corridors of Rig Theta, fast enough in the blood-slick alleyways of New Carthage, where 3 of his fellow marshals had died in a single week, and he'd kept walking, kept filing reports, kept pressing his badge to checkpoint scanners with a hand that barely shook. 41 years of fast enough. And then, on a Tuesday night in Sector Block 19 of the Vance orbital habitat, with rain hammering the polycarb windows and the smell of fried protein and fierce sweat thick in the recycled air, he was not fast enough. Half a second, maybe less. The perp's name was Dolos. He was 19, rail-thin, wild-eyed, and loosely affiliated with the Kessler Syndicate, or had been, until the Syndicate decided he was more liability than asset and left him stranded in Sector 19 with a bag of stimulants and a plasma cutter he barely knew how to operate. William Cade had seen 100 Doloses in his career. He'd processed most of them. He knew the look, the twitching jaw, the way the eyes couldn't settle on a fixed point, the hands always moving, always adjusting, looking for a way out that didn't exist. He knew the look so well that he had, for one brief and terrible moment, taken it entirely for granted, categorized it, filed it, moved on without actually seeing it. He was already reaching for his restraint binder when Dolos fired. The plasma burst caught Cade high on the left shoulder and spun him into the wall. He went down hard, his cheek against the cold floor, smelling burned jacket and burned flesh, and the iron penny smell of his own blood pooling beneath him. He heard Dolos run, fast, uneven footsteps, the sound of someone terrified of what they'd just done. He lay there for a moment, listening to his own breathing, taking inventory of what hurt and what didn't, doing the methodical arithmetic of injury that he'd learned on Kepler-7 before Dolos had been born. Left shoulder compromised, right arm functional, legs functional, head clear enough to function. He pressed his hand to the wound and activated his emergency beacon and waited for backup with the same professional patience he brought to everything. He filed the incident report from the medical bay 6 hours later. He filed it correctly and on time with full supporting documentation. He did everything procedurally right except the one thing that mattered, which was not getting shot in the first place. When Chief Marshal Vera Onuora came to see him the next morning, she brought real coffee. The expensive kind, not the synthetic compound the commissary used, actual coffee from Earth's last functioning highland plantation, and a look on her face that he had never seen in 41 years. He knew what she was going to say before she said it. He knew it the moment he saw the coffee. "You've earned it," she told him quietly, "every day of those 41 years. I don't want it. I know you don't." She set the coffee on the bedside table and sat down in the chair that was too small for her broad frame and looked at him with those deep, level eyes that had always reminded him of open space, not empty but vast and patient and full of things you couldn't see from where you were standing. She'd been chief marshal for 16 years. Before that, she'd done 23 years of field work herself on the outer habitats, where the support structures were thin and the work was the kind that aged people in ways that showed. She understood what she was saying. That was what made it harder. "You can run the intake academy on Callisto Station. Good work. Genuinely important work. You'd be shaping the next generation of marshals." "That's not what I do." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." She was quiet for a long moment, both hands around the coffee cup she'd brought for him, warming them. "There's another option." He waited. "The Reach." She said it simply, without performance, the way you said the name of a place you'd never visited and had no plans to visit. The Reach was what the orbital habitats and registered settlements called the space beyond, the uncharted, unincorporated, unregulated expanse of mining platforms, drift stations, and lawless deep space clusters that existed beyond the jurisdictional boundary of any registered enforcement agency. Beyond the reach of the law, as people said, which had eventually shortened simply to the Reach. No marshal had ever been formally assigned there because there was no formal anything to assign to. No supply infrastructure, no communication relays beyond the midpoint boundary, no backup, no detention facilities, no evidence processing chain, no quarterly review board, no chain of command stretching back to some comfortable climate-controlled office on a registered habitat. Just the dark, the people in it, and whatever law you could carry on your own body and enforce with your own judgment. "You'd be walking out," Onuora said. "No recall, no support. You go alone, and you go until you don't." She looked at him for a long, careful time, the way she looked at things she was deciding how to hold. 3 days, she said finally, after your shoulder heals enough to carry a pack. He spent those 3 days doing exactly what he had done every other day of his adult working life. He filed his reports. He processed his pending caseload. 12 open cases, 2 complex, the rest straightforward, with the same systematic attention he'd brought to every case in 4 decades, giving each one the work it deserved, not more and not less. He forwarded his open investigations to Marshal Calla Reese, who was 34 and sharp and meticulous in the way that young marshals trained under good supervision became meticulous. He left notes on each file, not instructions, because Reese didn't need instruction but context, the particular context that lived inside a case and could only be conveyed by someone who'd been sitting with it. He ate his meals in the commissary at his usual table. He drank 2 cups of coffee each morning and read the daily incident logs and slept 6 hours. Each night without chemical assistance, which had always been one of the quiet things he was proud of. The ability to sleep, the ability to put the day down. On the morning of the 3rd day, he packed 1 rucksack with field gear, compressed rations for 30 days, enough to get established before he'd need to source locally. Medical kit, full. A portable signal processor he was moderately certain would function only intermittently beyond the midpoint boundary. 1 change of underclothes. A photograph he kept folded in his jacket that he'd been keeping folded in his jacket for 11 years, and that he had no intention of looking at and no intention of leaving behind. He strapped on his marshal's kit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been strapping on marshal's kit every morning for 4 decades. Standard issue coil arm at his right hip, long barrel plasma rifle on a sling across his back, 6 spare charge cells in the panel of his jacket, the badge. He stood in front of the mirror in his quarters and looked at himself for a moment. He looked at the badge specifically. He'd had it long enough that he'd stopped seeing it. It had become part of the landscape of himself, like his hands or the gray that had moved through his hair over the past decade. He saw it now. It was scratched and dull, and had been repinned 3 times on 3 different jackets. He pressed his thumb against it once and put it in his breast pocket where it belonged and walked out. The honor guard was unexpected and unwanted, and it was the most important thing anyone had done for him in years. 17 marshals in full dress uniform lined the main corridor from his quarters to the docking bay. He'd had no say in it. He would have argued against it if he'd been consulted, would have said it wasn't necessary, would have meant it and also been wrong. He walked the corridor with his rucksack on one shoulder and his chin level, and he looked straight ahead, and the 7 seconds of walking took longer than 7 seconds in the way that certain passages of time refused to be measured by clocks. He saw each face in his peripheral vision and didn't let himself linger on any of them. He was near the end when Calla Reese stepped forward from the line and pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand without looking at him. A quick, deliberate transfer like a relay baton, and he tucked it into his jacket without looking at it. He read it 3 hours later, aboard the transit shuttle, in the dark with the stars outside the viewport and the drive's low hum in the walls. It said, "Don't forget that being right isn't the same as being alone." He folded it small and put it in his breast pocket alongside the badge. The midpoint boundary wasn't marked on any official chart. It existed only in practice, the point at which the last relay buoy's signal faded to static, the point at which you were, by the operational definition of the enforcement agency, on your own. Someone had marked it with a decommissioned navigation buoy, long since dead, tumbling in a slow rotation in the dark. And someone, with poor penmanship and apparently a great deal of time and something very strong to feel about it, had attached a hand-painted sign to the buoy. The sign read "No Law, 4,000 clicks." He held his shuttle in a hover relative to the buoy's rotation and looked at it through the forward viewport. The stars moved slowly behind it. The boy turned, silent and patient. He thought about Dolus, about the specific moment of the mistake, not the slowness of the draw, but the prior moment, the invisible moment, the moment of assumption, the having seen it before that had replaced actually seeing. He thought about it for approximately 90 seconds, which was as long as he generally permitted himself to think about things that were done and couldn't be undone, because beyond 90 seconds, the thinking became something other than useful. Then he cut the autopilot and took the controls himself and flew into the dark. The first settlement he found was a mining cluster called Dust Bowl 7. 4 modular platforms bolted together around a depleted asteroid core, home to perhaps 200 people who survived on processed mineral exports, black market trade, and the compressed solidarity of people who were very far from any help and had made that distance into a way of life. He landed without announcement, which was the right choice. Announcements in the Reach were either ignored or prepared for, and neither was useful when you were trying to see things clearly. He walked the platforms for 3 hours with his badge on his chest, and his coil arm on his hip, and the particular quality of unhurried attention that was his most effective professional tool. He noted what he saw. 2 functioning water reclamation units, one failing, its telltale vibration pattern consistent with a bearing seal that had been neglected for 6 months or more. A food distribution processor that was clearly being skimmed at the point of allocation. The caloric outputs didn't match the inputs, and the discrepancy was too consistent to be error. 3 separate groups of individuals who watched him with the specific stillness of people, calculating whether his presence was a threat or an opportunity. One woman, elderly, sitting in a doorway and watching all of it with the look of someone who'd decided she'd seen enough of this particular chapter of human history, have opinions about how it ended. And one man, heavyset, pale, with soft hands and the particular ease of someone who'd decided a long time ago that comfort was his birthright. He sat in the center of the largest platform in a chair that was a precise 8 centimeters taller than every other chair in the space, which Cade noted and filed because nothing about that was accidental. His name was Peck. He had 2 men with him who carried better weapons than anyone else on the platform. He had the practiced look of authority that existed in abandoned spaces the way mold existed in damp corners. Not invited, not wanted by most, but establishing itself, spreading, becoming structural before anyone decided to do something about it. "Marshall," said Peck. He let the words sit in his mouth for a moment, tasting it. "It's been a while since we've had one of those out here. Food distribution is being siphoned," Cade said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't position it as an accusation. He stated it as he would have stated any finding, directly, accurately, without the particular ugliness of theater. "The reclamation unit in Module C has a failing bearing seal. If it fails completely, you'll lose 40% of your water supply within 90 days. The allocations in Row 7 are running at less than half the registered standard." Peck's smile was the kind that lived entirely below the cheekbones. "This is the Reach, Marshall. We have our own arrangements out here. That's the second thing people tell me when I arrive somewhere," Cade said. "I keep waiting to find out what the first thing is." One of Peck's men shifted his weight. Cade noted it without looking at him directly. The shift was threat positioning, not preparation, a show rather than an intention. He filed it as such and left it alone. "You're going to fix the reclamation unit," Cade said, "starting today. You're going to recalibrate the distribution processor to factory allocation standards. I'll be back in 8 days to verify." He paused. "If the situation is unchanged at that point, I won't be issuing citations." Peck's smile held. "What will you be issuing?" "Nothing," Cade said. He slept in his shuttle with the door locked. He ate a compressed ration that tasted like chalk and factory grain and thought it was probably the best meal he'd have for the next several weeks. He reviewed the platform's structural readings on his portable sensor unit for 2 hours before he slept, because understanding the physical reality of a place was the most reliable foundation for understanding everything else about it. In the morning, the water reclamation unit in Module C had been attended to, imperfectly, bearing replaced but the housing not properly resealed, which meant it would need attention again in 3 months rather than 12, but attended to nonetheless. Someone had left a bowl of actual food outside the shuttle hatch. He stood and looked at it for a moment. He left it there. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because accepting it meant something he hadn't earned yet and wasn't ready to accept. He flew on. The Reach was not a wasteland. He understood that within the first week, with the particular clarity that came from actually being somewhere rather than understanding it from reports. The Reach was a wound, a place that the rest of inhabited space had stopped looking at because looking at it required acknowledging the specific shape of human expansion, which was reach further than you could hold, take what you wanted, leave what you couldn't use, and call the leaving a natural condition rather than a choice. In the Reach, people had built something in the space left by that abandonment. Not civilization by the definitions used in Regispace, no accreditation systems, no arbitration courts, no supply chain regulation, but something. Water systems improvised from salvage. medical practices that combined standard training with generations of practical adaptation to conditions no medical academy had prepared anyone for. Councils that met and argued and sometimes failed and sometimes didn't. Schools that ran on whatever the local expert population could teach, which turned out to be a great deal. Children who grew up understanding the physical mechanics of their habitat the way children in registered space understood geography. The reach was, in the particular way of places that had been abandoned by the civilization that produced them, enormously human. Stubbornly, ingenuously, inadequately, triumphantly human. Cade watched it with something that lived in the neighborhood of both grief and awe and refused to be only one of them. He had been in the Reach for 31 days, had visited 11 settlements, had addressed 4 situations that qualified as emergencies under the agency's operational definitions, had declined to address 3 situations that qualified under the same definitions but that were, on closer inspection, the Reach's own systems working out problems in the Reach's own way. When he first heard the name Keth Vorath, he heard it from Sadie Drum. She ran a fuel processing station on a drift platform that she'd built herself from 3 wrecked haulers over 12 years of deliberate salvage. Work, a project of such sustained, meticulous ambition that Katie spent his first hour at her platform simply walking the joins and connections, following the logic of construction. It was excellent work. Not perfect. No improvised construction in the Reach was perfect, but excellent in the way that comes from someone who understood deeply what they were building and why each choice mattered. She herself was perhaps 50, brown and compact and sharp-featured, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades looking into engine exhaust and solar reflections. She had approximately no patience for institutional authority of any kind, which she communicated in the specific way of people who have principled objections rather than reflexive ones, directly and without hostility, which was considerably more useful. She told him about the Keth Vorath without preamble, the way she seemed to do most things, as information, not as appeal. They came through the Lanark cluster 4 months ago. Nobody in the Reach had a name for them, so we made one. She poured 2 cups of something hot and brown that was not coffee and pushed one across the workbench without making it an offer, just a placement. The drive signature doesn't match any registry. The ship class doesn't match any registered taxonomy. 7 to 9 of them. The accounts differ because things happened fast, and not everyone who saw them is the kind of person whose account you rely on afterward. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. They went into Lanark Station and they took 12 people and they left. Nobody found bodies. Nobody found evidence of violence at the station itself. They just took people and went. Cade drank the not coffee. It tasted like burned bark and was not unpleasant. What direction afterward? Toward the Var Belt. She pulled a navigation display from under the bench and brought it up with the practiced ease of someone who knew her tools without looking at them. The Var Belt mapped as a dense interference region, the overlapping debris fields and mineral dust clouds of a system that had once been geologically active and had spent 10,000 years distributing the evidence of that activity across an enormous volume of space. 3 settlements out there, Var 3, Var 11, and the Congregation. About 600 people total. The Congregation is the biggest. It's also the newest. They've been building for 3 years. They're not set up for anything like what hit Lanark. She looked at him levelly. You're one man. That's the arrangement. I'm noting it as a fact, not a judgment. She looked at the display. Whatever you find in the Var Belt, you find alone. No agency support, no backup, nothing. I know. And you're still going. I'm still going. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached under the bench and produced a data chip and slid it across the surface. Not an offer, not a gift, just a placement. He recognized the manner. It was her manner, consistent throughout. Route maps, drift pattern projections for the next 60 days. As current as anything out here gets. The Congregation isn't on any standard chart. She looked at the display rather than at him. My brother lives there. He took the chip. He stood and shouldered his pack. He didn't say thank you, because the situation didn't call for thanks. It called for the work being done, which he was going to do. He walked back to his shuttle. Behind him, he heard her go back to her engines, the sound of tools against metal, methodical and clear. The Var Belt was navigationally a nightmare. Dense interference, unpredictable drift patterns, debris fields that shifted on timescales too short for standard charts to track accurately. Sadie's maps were the difference between navigating it and spending 3 days making no progress while burning fuel reserves. He spent most of the transit studying them with the same meticulous attention he'd given to every case file for 4 decades. Not looking for specific answers, but building a comprehensive model. The kind that lets you recognize anomalies when they appeared because you understood the baseline. He found VAR3 first, population at last registry, 41, current status when he docked, intact, functional, and wound tight with a specific kind of fear that he'd started to recognize in the reach. Not the panic of active threat, but the sustained vigilance of a community that had heard what happened to Lanak and was waiting, with the patient dread of people who knew their waiting was finite, for their version of it. He spent 6 hours there. He listened more than he spoke, which was his consistent practice in a new location, understanding what people were carrying before deciding what you could add. He learned that the Keth Voreth had come through VAR3 9 days earlier. They'd taken nothing. They damaged nothing. They'd left 3 of their own dead in the main thoroughfare of the platform, arranged with a precision that was clearly deliberate, facing outward, hands open at their sides, equidistant from each other, oriented toward what appeared to be a specific direction but might have been random, impossible to know without more context. Nobody had moved the bodies. He looked at them for a long time. They were not human. That was the most accurate thing he could say. Not alien. Because alien was a word humans had carried into space the way you carried old furniture. Into a new house, transporting the shape of thinking that didn't necessarily fit the new space. These were not human. They were taller by perhaps a third, and lean in a way that suggested structural differences below the surface. The joints placed at slightly unexpected positions, the proportions subtly wrong in a way that was difficult to locate precisely because it was distributed across the whole body, rather than concentrated in any one feature. Their skin was a deep, matte blue-gray, textured like compressed mineral aggregate. Their faces had 2 eye structures, elongated, horizontal, pupilless silver, positioned above a jaw that was wider than the upper skull, giving the whole face an inverted quality, bottom-heavy, in a way that read as wrong before you could articulate why. They wore nothing. They carried nothing visible. Their wounds were consistent with plasma fire, which meant someone in Lanak had fought back. He photographed them with his signal processor. He took tissue samples with the precision of someone trained in evidence collection, which he was. He ran his processor's database against every registered non-human species in the inhabited systems. Nothing matched. Completely nothing. Not a partial match, not a near miss. These were something the catalogs didn't have. He sat with that for a moment. Then he moved on to VAR 11. Population at last registry, 83. Current status, evacuated. Not abandoned, evacuated, which was a different thing. The cups were half drunk, and the doors were open, and the lights were on in the commissary. They'd left fast when they decided to leave, which meant they'd been watching and had a threshold and had honored it when it was reached. He hoped they'd found somewhere safe to go. He went on. He found the congregation 7 hours later, deep in the belt's interference layer where Sadie's maps placed it, at a set of coordinates that weren't on any standard chart, and that wouldn't be visible to anyone approaching without specific directional information. It was larger than he'd expected. Not 3 modules, but 5. The newest edition raw at the joins. The construction quality different from the others, clearly recent. Population beacon, 612. He came in slow and broadcast his marshal's ident on every available band, not wanting to be misread as the thing that had been hitting settlements in the belt. There was a silence that lasted long enough to tell him they were discussing it, and then a voice came on, young and female and controlled, carrying the specific weight of someone performing steadiness rather than feeling it, and said, "We receive you, Marshal. Bay 3 is clear." Her name was Tem Vargo, and she was 32 years old and had been a keeper of the congregation since the settlement's 3rd year, which meant she'd been helping govern it since before it was large enough to need governance, which was the kind of early start that either broke people or shaped them into something exceptional. She met him at the bay with 2 other keepers, a broad man with careful posture named Arash Noor, and an older woman, Greth Sundell, who said nothing and watched everything with the patient, measuring quality of someone who built things and understood that you couldn't build, something that held without understanding the stresses it would face. Tem Vargo had close-cropped dark hair and steady hands, and a quality of complete presence that Katie associated with people who'd been responsible for others long enough that it had changed the way they inhabited time. Not anxious, not frantic. Deeply here, In the way you had to be when the people you were responsible for needed you to be here, rather than somewhere, in your own concerns. You've had contact, Cade said, 8 days ago. She walked as she talked, moving through corridors with the easy familiarity of someone who'd built the habit of motion into her days. They came to the outer perimeter of the belt. They disabled 2 of our sensor buoys, not destroyed, disabled. The signals became static, and then they withdrew without approaching further. We believe they were counting the settlement, assessing it. She led him through the hub into a secondary corridor where a planning display was active, showing the settlement's structural layout. They took 11 people from Lanark. Not killed, taken, as far as anyone can determine. We've had no contact with Lanark since the incident. The body's at VAR 3, Cade said. Tem's jaw tightened slightly, a controlled reflex. We know about them. What's your read? Still developing. It might be a message. It might be a territorial marker. It might be something structurally different from either of those. Something we don't have the right frame for yet. Arashnur spoke for the first time. His voice was careful and precise. The voice of someone who chose words because they meant things. A demonstration of what they can afford to lose. Cade looked at him. That's a possibility I'm holding. The 3 of them were quiet for a moment with what that meant. He spent the rest of that first day learning the congregation in the systematic way he'd learned every new location he'd worked. Walking every corridor, checking every hatch and pressure seal, testing every system he could test without disrupting operations. He spoke to the technicians and farmers and medics. He spoke to the children, who were the most useful informants in any new location, because they reported what they'd actually observed, rather than what they'd decided was appropriate to report. He ate dinner in the commissary, communal, 600 people. A level of organized logistics that in registered space required specialized management software, and in the congregation was achieved through what appeared to be accumulated habit and mutual understanding. He noted the food quality, which was adequate. He noted the social cohesion, which was high. He noted the baseline anxiety level, which was elevated but controlled. The specific controlled quality of a community that was scared and had decided that being scared in an organized way was better than the alternatives. He slept 4 hours and started again. He was reviewing the settlement's energy consumption patterns in the early hours of the second morning, when the sensor buoys went to static, not disabled, scrambled, their signals becoming noise rather than silence, which was in some ways worse than silence, because noise looked like function. Cade felt his stomach go cold in the specific way it had learned over 4 decades to go cold. Not with fear, but with clarity, the cold of everything becoming very sharp and very simple. He was on the settlement's communications system before anyone else had processed what they were seeing on the sensors. All keepers, all personnel, seal the non-essential modules immediately. C&D population transfer to the hub now. Lock the outer bays. Do not activate the general alarm. He kept his voice flat and direct, which was the right register. Not calm in a way that denied urgency. Not urgent in a way that created panic. I need a keeper in the hub now. Tem's voice came back immediately. She'd already been awake. On my way? How long? Minutes, possibly less. He didn't know that with certainty. He might have had longer. But he had also learned in 41 years that the communities that survived were the ones that moved at the speed of, possibly less, rather than the speed of wait and see. They didn't waste time they might not have had. He was right. It was minutes. The first breach was in Module E, the newest module, the raw joins, the construction quality that differed from the rest. The outer hull interface opened with a circular aperture that left no blast residue, no burn scarring, no evidence of explosive or thermal cutting. The hull simply had a door where it hadn't had one, as if the material had been convinced to reconfigure rather than forced. 3 of them came through the opening. Cade watched it on the internal sensor feed and felt the particular vertigo of something outside the catalog. Not fear exactly, but the cognitive disorientation of confronting something genuinely without precedent in your operational experience, and having to proceed anyway. They moved with a quality that was difficult to locate precisely. Quickly, but the speed was fluid rather than sharp. It didn't look like muscle working against skeleton, like the rapid human movement Cade had spent 4 decades around. It looked like something organized differently, like the speed came from a different physical architecture. They didn't look around when they entered the module. They already knew where to go. He closed the module bulkhead from the hub controls and sealed it. He heard the impact, not a thud, not the sharp percussive sound of a body hitting metal, but something lower and longer and more even, like measured pressure applied across the entire surface. The bulkhead held. He looked at the internal display for 2 seconds and made a set of decisions. He had 1 coil arm, 1 plasma rifle, 6 charge cells, 1 operational mind with 4 decades of problem-solving experience. He had 612 people who needed to be alive at the end of this, and he had the particular quality of settled clarity that came from having exactly one thing to do, and no ambiguity about whether it was the right thing. He went to find Tem Vargo. She was in the corridor outside the medical bay, coordinating the patient transfer, her hands moving and her voice level. And when she saw his face, she said without preamble, 3 inside, bulkhead sealed, unknown outside. What do you need? 12 people. Not fighters. I need people who can hold a position and follow a single instruction exactly without breaking it, under pressure. Can you find me that? Yes. She was already moving 3 minutes. She found 9 in 2 minutes. He looked at them for about 5 seconds. A woman with a long scar down one forearm who held her weapon with the ease of long familiarity. 2 young men who were clearly brothers and who looked at each other before looking at Katie, with the specific exchange of people who've already decided what they'll do if things go badly. An older man with an engineer's deliberate hands. 4 others with the particular stillness of people who'd faced hard things before and found out what they were made of. The beings in Module E will breach the bulkhead, Cade said. I don't know exactly when. When they do, I need 3 of you at the intersection of B and D corridors, facing Module E's access point. Here. He indicated the settlement layout on the hub display. The rest divided between these 2 secondary positions. You do not fire unless I fire first, or unless there is a second breach behind your positions. If a second breach occurs behind you, fire immediately and don't stop. Does everyone understand that? They did. Good. Your goal isn't to win a firefight. Your goal is to make the cost of this settlement very high. Any questions? There were none. He placed them precisely, and then he went to find Greth Sundell. She was in the lower hub with 41 children between the ages of 3 and 14, and she was teaching them a counting game. Not because she believed a counting game was the optimal activity in this specific moment, but because she understood, with the same intelligence that had designed the settlement's overlapping defensive module layout, that a group of frightened children who were doing a specific focused thing was dramatically safer than a group of frightened children who were sitting with what they were frightened of. The game required attention. Attention excluded the other things. She was teaching and simultaneously watching the entry points with the alert stillness of someone who had been through bad situations before and knew what needed to be watched. The children's voices made a rhythm. She looked up when Cade came in. 3 inside Module E, bulkhead holding. 9 of your people positioned at BD intersection and 2 secondary points. I'm going back to Module E now. She studied him with those level eyes. You're going in. I need to understand what they want. I can't operate effectively on what they've done. I need the why. We know what they want. They want to take people. I know what they've done. I don't yet know what it means to them. He met her gaze. Understanding that difference determines whether I stop this once or stop it permanently. Greth Sundell was quiet for a moment. The counting rhythm continued behind her, the children's voices steady in the particular cadence of a learned game. My first son was killed in a labor dispute on Argus platform, she said, not as a digression, as a point. He was 22. The people who ordered it never understood why anyone would fight back. They thought having more meant being safe. It didn't. No, Kate agreed. She looked at him for another moment. Don't be heroic and dead, she said. Be specific and present. We need the latter. He almost smiled. I'll try to keep that in order. He went back to Module E's sealed bulkhead. The vibration against it had changed character. Early on it had been steady, even, the quality of force being applied uniformly. Now it was more specific, more targeted, moving across the surface of the bulkhead in a pattern that was unmistakably systematic. They were mapping it, finding the precise points of mechanical tolerance, locating where the seal was weakest, applying pressure there and there and there, with the methodical patience of intelligence, working through a problem. Not brute force. Engineering. He stood with his back to the opposite wall and looked at the bulkhead and felt the floor's faint vibration in his feet and thought about the lapse that had brought him here. Not the slowness, the prior moment of assumption, the having seen it before that had substituted for actually seeing. He would not make that error here. He had nothing to substitute for seeing. He had never seen anything like what was on the other side of this bulkhead, which was either the most dangerous situation he'd been in for 41 years or its own strange protection, because you could not assume about something genuinely without precedent. He would see what was there. The bulkhead failed without drama. A long exhale sound, a pressure equalization, and then the circular aperture was there, where the bulkhead had been solid, and the three of them came through. Larger than the bodies at VAR 3 had suggested, or those had been smaller individuals. These were fully mature by whatever developmental standard applied to them. The horizontal silver eyes caught the corridor's light and reflected it in a way that was geometrically different from how human eyes reflect light. Flatter, broader, more like a mirror surface than a lens. The blue-gray skin in person had a faint texture visible at close range, like the surface of compressed silicate rock. The joints moved in a way that made his visual system throw small errors, not wrong enough to fully register, just wrong enough to never quite resolve into the expected, like an image very slightly out of focus that remains forever unresolved rather than becoming clear. He stood facing them in the corridor and did not move for a weapon. He looked at them. He made himself actually look, without filtering the information through anything he'd seen before. They stopped. This was worth noting. They looked at him. He looked at them. 4 seconds of silence, 5, 6. Then the center one, the largest, with a pattern of darker texture across its upper torso that might have been markings, might have been scarring, might have been something without a human equivalent, raised one hand. Not the rapid, angled raising of a threat gesture. Slow, deliberate, steady, a presentation, a statement, an offering of information about itself. He raised his own hand. The same motion, mirrored as precisely as the structural difference between their bodies allowed. The center one's horizontal eyes moved from his hand to his face and back to his raised hand, and then, with the same deliberateness, it lowered its own, and waited. He lowered his. He stood in the corridor with three beings that existed completely outside the accumulated catalog of 2 centuries of human space exploration, and they looked at each other in the light of a habitat 600 clicks into the VAR belt. And nobody fired, and nobody ran, and the children's counting game was a faint rhythm from 2 corridors away, and for 37 seconds the corridor was a place where something that had never happened before in the history of 2 different kinds of intelligence was happening in the particular way it always happens for the first time, which is badly and tentatively and with an enormous amount at stake. The center one made a sound. He felt it more than heard it, a low, complex frequency with internal structure, with variation that his audio processor flagged as patterned communication. It was language. It was completely beyond his signal processor's translation capacity. But language had a cadence that was, at some level, independent of phonology, and he'd spent 4 decades learning to read the cadence of human language across dozens of dialects and registers. And the cadence of this was not threatening and not demanding. It was asking. He said, "I don't understand you yet." The sound of his voice produced a response. Not retreat, not aggression, but a quality of increased attention. The 3 of them looked at each other, and the center one made a shorter sound, and the 2 flanking ones stepped back. Precisely, by exactly 1 step, synchronized, and held their new positions, displaying structure, displaying hierarchy, displaying willingness to indicate both. He thought, they're showing me who and what they are in relation to each other. They're telling me something about how they work. He said, "I'm going to move. Slowly. I'll show you what I'm doing before I do it." He held both hands up and open where they could see them. Then slowly, he reached to his belt, unclipped his coil arm, held it at arm's length, set it on the floor of the corridor, and straightened, hands visible. The center one processed this for approximately 5 seconds. Then it reached to its own body and removed the implement that had been attached there. Not a weapon by any design logic Cade could identify, more a tool, something with a purpose he couldn't immediately determine, and set it on the floor between them with the same deliberate motion. Not mimicry, an echo, a response in the same language. He breathed. What followed was 3 hours of the most difficult and important work he'd done in 41 years. And he'd done almost none of it before, and he made errors constantly and didn't know what most of the errors were, and he kept going anyway. He had no translation framework. He had no shared reference points beyond the physical reality of the corridor, the objects in it, the 2 kinds of bodies occupying it. He had only what he'd spent his entire career developing, the capacity to watch without evaluating, to receive information without rushing it into a pre-existing category, to hold uncertainty without retreating from it. He learned nothing in words. He learned in the accumulated weight of responses. What produced withdrawal? What produced stillness? What produced the forward lean of increased attention? What produced the specific complex sound that he gradually understood to be something like acknowledgement, something like yes, something like we are still engaged with this. He learned that they had come from beyond the mapped systems. He learned this from the way they responded to his signal processor's star charts. 3 charts pulled up on the small display, covering the known inhabited volume. And they'd looked at them without recognition for a moment, and then one of the flanking ones had made a specific gesture toward the display and then toward a direction that pointed away from every charted system, which was not itself a star map but was information. He learned that the 11 people from Lanik had not been killed. He learned this from a long and difficult and partially failed exchange involving gesture and response, and the kind of persistent repetition of a concept that only works when both parties are committed to finding the edge of shared understanding. He was angry about the 11 people. He held the anger where it was useful, which was as information rather than as direction. He thought he learned, with the low confidence level that all first contact inference deserved, that they had encountered human space and had no framework for how to initiate contact, that their approach to Lanik had been, in whatever their equivalent of intention was, an attempt at exchange rather than an act of predation, that the catastrophic wrongness of what they'd done was not malice. Malice was something he understood how to work with. Genuine ignorance of the wrong was different. Neither better nor worse, but different, requiring a different approach. He had been a marshal for 41 years. He'd worked with malice often enough to have developed a sophisticated operational relationship with it. He had never worked with genuine first-contact ignorance of this specific shape and scale. And he was building the approach as he went, with the accumulated materials of 4 decades of fieldwork and 1 long corridor conversation that was going better than it had any right to go. He said, "The people you took from Lanik." He said it clearly and carefully, holding the words in the air. "I need them returned." He said it twice more. He said it with his hands. He said it with as much of the established gestural vocabulary as he'd assembled in 3 hours, which was not much. He said it with the specific quality of intention that had always been what Onuora said separated him from every other marshal. She'd trained, not force, not speed, not even intelligence in the abstract sense, but intention. The capacity to hold a goal so clearly and steadily that it communicated itself through every layer of the exchange, making the goal itself legible regardless of the limits of shared language. The center one was very still. Its horizontal eyes didn't move. It remained in that quality of stillness for a long time. Not the stillness of blankness, but the stillness of something processing at depth. Then it picked up its implement from the floor and turned and walked back through the aperture. And the other 2 followed, and the corridor was empty. He stood in it alone. He picked up his coil arm. He holstered it with hands that were steady, because he had learned to have steady hands. He went to the hub and he told Tem Vargo what had happened as accurately as he could, and she listened without interrupting in the way of someone who understood that interrupting would cost more than it would gain. When he finished, she said, "What do we do now? We hold our positions. We don't pursue. We wait." He paused. "And we operate on the assumption that intention communicates something, even when language doesn't." She looked at him. "That's either very optimistic or very experienced." "I can't always tell the difference," he said. 41 years and I still can't always tell." He sat with Arash Noor in the hub for the rest of the night, the 2 of them monitoring the sensors and saying very little, which turned out to be exactly the right amount. At roughly 0200, Arash produced a flask of something clear and passed it across without comment, which Katie accepted and drank and passed back. And the specific warmth of it was the specific warmth of a small human gesture in the dark. Sufficient, complete, requiring nothing. He thought about Calarissa's note, about what being right without being alone meant when you were one man in a habitat, deep in the Var belt. He thought it probably meant something like this, not the absence of aloneness, but the presence, even in the outer dark, of human gestures. The flask, the note, Sadie's data chip, Gretha's children counting in rhythm. He had been alone in the Reach for 31 days, and had not been alone for any of them, which was a specific truth about humanity that he'd known abstractly for most of his life, and was learning concretely, daily, with a precision that only came from being here rather than knowing it from reports. 22 hours after the beings left Module E, a signal arrived. It came on a frequency that the congregation's receivers couldn't normally access, outside the standard bands, outside any registered communication protocol. It arrived as a burst of structured data that his signal processor flagged as intentional patterning and couldn't decode. He spent 6 hours on the problem and made no progress using standard decryption approaches. Then he set the decryption aside and came at it from the other direction. Not what the data said, but what it was doing. What had the corridor exchange established? Structure, hierarchy, reciprocal gesture. The concept that placing an object in a specific position communicated something about the intent of the placer relative to the exchange. What if the structure of the transmission was the message? Not a content to be decoded, but a form to be read, like a map embedded in a description of walking? At hour 7, he found a coordinate embedded in the data structure. Not stated, pointed to. It was pointing at Lannick Station. He told Tim. She said, "You think they're giving them back. I think they may be indicating where they are. It might not be the same thing." "No," she agreed. It might not be. 19 hours alone, on a course that Sadie's drift pattern projections made navigable. He went because the evidence suggested it, and because the alternative was waiting for certainty that wasn't available. And he had learned, not from the Reach specifically, but from 41 years of work in places where certainty was never fully available, that waiting for certainty was a way of choosing inaction, and inaction had its own consequences that certainty rarely accounted for. Lannick Station was where it should be, lit, functional, and broadcasting standard ident signals. He docked. His comms registered 11 personal ident signals simultaneously before he'd finished the docking sequence. 11 people alive in the main facility. He walked into the station. 2 of the Kethvorth were there, standing in the facility's main space, and they left when he entered. Not fast, not startled, they simply went, with the deliberateness of beings completing a thing they'd decided to do. Moving to the exit and through it and gone. He spent 2 hours with the 11. They were unharmed, shaken, hungry, frightened, but physically unharmed. They had been fed with substances that weren't food by human metabolic definition, but that had maintained their basic nutritional status, which meant the Kethvorth had spent the intervening weeks working out what humans required to function. Several of them had had exchanges with the beings in the same halting gestural mode he'd experienced in the corridor. A young engineer named Paolo, 26, from a registered habitat on the inner edge of the Reach, the son of someone who'd made the long walk out here 15 years ago and built something, had spent a week separated from the others, in close proximity to a single being that had watched everything he did with the quality of someone building a catalog. It wasn't threatening, Paolo said. He was sitting with a cup of actual water in both hands, drinking it slowly, paying attention to it in the way people paid attention to things after a period of not having them. Not after the first day, it was watching. Everything I did, how I did it, the way I used my hands, what I ate, how I slept. It kept not pointing at things exactly, but orienting toward them, like it was asking me to look at whatever it was looking at. He was quiet for a moment. I started to feel like we were having a conversation, like there was something building between us, just very slowly, very piece by piece. He looked at Cade. It was trying to learn us. That's what it was doing, the whole time. It was trying to learn what we were. Cade thought about the structure of the transmission, about the coordinate embedded like a map in a description of walking, about the implement placed on the floor of the corridor. "Yes," he said. "I think that's exactly what was happening." He brought all 11 to the congregation. He spent 4 more days there, establishing what he could with the resources available and no institutional support beyond what the community itself could provide, which turned out to be considerable. He worked with Arash Noor on the Module E bulkhead restoration, the 2 of them spending most of a day doing patient technical work in comfortable near silence. And at one point Arash said, without looking up from the housing seal, "You could stay," and Cade said, without looking up from the coupling joint, "I know," and neither of them said anything else about it, which was the right amount. He helped the settlement's engineer, Cass, meticulous, deliberate, with the hands of someone who'd been building things in low-margin environments her whole life, identify and address the 3 structural weak points that had made Module E accessible. He sat in on one of Greth Sundell's evening sessions with the children, in which she was teaching basic habitat mechanics and emergency protocols through a system of games and stories that was one of the most sophisticated pedagogical approaches he'd encountered in 41 years across dozens of educational systems, including the Enforcement Academy's own programs. He ate 3 meals a day and slept 6 hours a night and felt, with a specificity that surprised him, something like located. Like here was a real place and he was in it. On the 5th morning, Grethy Sundell came to the docking bay while he was packing. She stood and watched him without helping or interfering, which was consistent with how she did everything. She had something in her hand, a piece of flat metal, rectangular, the kind of structural plate used in habitat construction. She'd cleaned it and refinished it and used something permanent to print text on it, something that would hold against UV exposure and deep cold and the long abrasion of vacuum. He finished packing and turned around and she held it out. He took it, he read it. Marshall was here, and below that smaller. Stay alive. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at her. It's not light, he said. You'll manage, she said. You've been managing heavier things than sheet metal for 40 years. He put it in his rucksack. He turned to go. He turned back. He said, your layout design for this settlement is excellent work. She looked at him. I know, she said. Go. He went. The weeks that followed were the work of the Reach as it actually was, not the Reach as it was understood from outside. He went to Dust Bowl 7 and verified the water reclamation repair and found it inadequate, and spent a day with the platform's actual technical operator, a quiet, thorough woman named Liz, who'd been doing the work of 2 positions because the platform couldn't staff them both, ensuring the repair was done to standard. He found VAR 11's evacuees at the New Harbor Assembly, a community of 300 people who'd built, from salvage and ingenuity and refusal to accept the conditions they'd been handed, a water system, a medical facility, a school, and a governance structure that was more functional than the administrative system of 4 registered habitats he could name. He spent 3 days there. He left them with emergency protocols and a signal frequency. They left him with a sealed container of preserved food that weighed 4 kilograms, and that he accepted because it was given in the spirit of exchange rather than charity, and because the distinction mattered. He developed a practice of leaving markers, not claimed stakes, not the institutional language of registered space, which had no meaning out here, but information, location of the nearest functional medical resource, signal frequencies for the settlements that had reliable communication, drift pattern data useful for navigation, the name of the marshal who'd been through, and what he'd found and what he'd left. The markers accumulated. He began to encounter people who'd heard of him through them, not his reputation exactly, but the specific information he'd left, which was more useful than reputation, and was in some ways what reputation was supposed to be when it was working correctly. He was 51 days in the Reach when Sadie Drum told him about the second signal. He'd come back to her platform to check in, partly because her charts were updated and more current than anything else available, partly because she was one of the most reliable observers of the Reach's conditions he'd found, and partly because her brother at the congregation was well and had asked him, when he'd been there, to convey that fact. He conveyed it. She had the flat expression of someone receiving news they'd been holding themselves against receiving badly, and received it well. Something came through the outer belt 6 days ago, she said. She pulled up the display without preamble. Different drive signature from the Keth Vorath. Different approach pattern. It's not in any registry I have. She showed him the data. It came from the direction of the outer veil. She looked at him. It followed your beacon. He looked at the approach pattern. He looked at the drive signature. He thought about the beacon he'd installed on his way back from the congregation. 4 hours of work with the fabrication unit. A specific decision about what he was doing here and what a marshal's presence in a place meant and how that meaning had to be communicated. He'd replaced the hand-painted sign with a functional beacon, low power, long duration, broadcasting on a frequency accessible to any ship with standard receivers. Marshal's Reach, enforcement active, coordinates for the congregation and 4 other settlements he'd designated as primary contact points. All parties contact before approach. Insufficient, probably futile in terms of what it could prevent. The only thing that made sense to do. What do you know about the outer veil? He asked. Not much, she said. Nobody does. It's past the edge of any survey data I've seen. Whatever's out there, we haven't looked. She looked at the approach pattern. It might be nothing. It might not be. You're going to go find out. Yes, alone. That's the arrangement. She studied him for a moment. She had the quality of someone deciding whether to say a thing that she was going to say, regardless. You know what you've done in 51 days? Not in terms of settlements helped or situations resolved. In terms of what you've changed about what this place is. He waited. People out here have been the Reach for 20 years, she said. The place beyond. The place where there's nothing. Where nobody comes and nobody cares and the lights go out and nothing happens about it because nothing was supposed to happen about it. You've been out here 51 days and now people know a marshal was here. People know a marshal is here. That's not the same thing as being safe. It's not the same thing as having everything be okay. She turned back to her display, which meant she was done. But it's something. It's a real thing that exists when it didn't before. I thought someone should say that. He stood with that for a moment. He'd never been good at receiving things, gifts or acknowledgments or the kind of direct human recognition that Sadie Drum had just offered him, simply and without ornament. He'd never found the right response that wasn't either dismissive or excessive. He said, "Thank you." She waved a hand at the engine housing without turning around. "There's food in the storage. Take some. Real food." He took some. He went back to his shuttle. He sat in the cockpit and looked at the approach pattern on his own display for a long time, running calculations, building the model. Then he began the intercept course. The intercept took 2 days. He came up on it carefully, broadcasting his marshal's ident on every band, including frequencies that weren't standard for inhabited space communication, covering the range he'd observed the Kethvorath using. The vessel, smaller than he'd expected, cylindrical, with drive architecture that looked like an independent engineering solution to the same basic problem as human drives, responded to his ident with a structured data burst that his processor couldn't decode, but that was clearly, unmistakably, intentional patterning. They knew he was there. They were answering. It was a survey vessel from a deep space research collective operating out of the far side of the outer veil. They had been mapping the approaches to the Reach for 11 years, moving slowly outward from their own home systems, cataloging what they found. They had received his beacon. They had followed the coordinates. He worked this out over several hours of gestural exchange that was better than the first corridor conversation had been, because he'd had that first corridor conversation and had learned something from it. They had wanted to know what enforcement active meant. He spent most of a day explaining it. He was not sure he succeeded in explaining it. He was fairly sure they came away with something. With the concept, if not the details, of a system of administered impartiality, of someone whose function was to be present for all parties rather than any one party's resource. He sent them Tem Vargo's contact frequency. He sent them the settlement coordinates for the congregation and the New Harbor Assembly. He sent them, on a frequency he now knew the Kethvorath used, a description of the encounter at Module E and its resolution, which might mean nothing to this survey vessel and might mean something, and in either case cost nothing to send. They went. He watched them on his sensors until they were past tracking range, and then he held in space for a while and thought. He thought about what Sadie had said, about what a real thing was when it existed in a place where it hadn't existed before. He thought about Caloris's note, which was still in his breast pocket alongside his badge, both of them present and structural in the specific way of things you carried with you not as reminders but as facts. Being right isn't the same as being alone. He had come into the Reach as one man with a rucksack and 6 charge cells and 41 years of work behind him, and the work had not stopped when he crossed the boundary. The work had found its specific shape out here, in the space where there was supposed to be nothing. He flew back through the VAR belt's interference layer, past the point where Sadie's routes mapped clearly, and into the scatter, where you needed to know the drift patterns and feel the sensor data rather than just read it. He passed the decommissioned buoy. His beacon was still transmitting. He stopped and checked it, verified the signal strength and the frequency spread, made one small adjustment to the broadcast power, and flew on. The New Harbor Assembly had sent a request through the signal network. A child with a respiratory infection that the settlement's medic was treating correctly but wanted a second opinion on. He diverted. He spent 6 hours at the assembly. The child's infection was responding to treatment. The medic's approach was sound. He confirmed both and answered 3 other medical questions the medic had been holding for lack of anyone to ask. The medic was 27 and had trained through distance learning on a 3-year self-directed program, because the nearest formal medical program was 14 months of transit away. She was, in his estimation, as clinically competent as most credentialed medics he'd worked with in registered space. She was also exhausted in the specific sustained way of people who'd been the only specialist in their area for too long. He stayed a second night. They talked for 3 hours over the not coffee equivalent that seemed to be the Reach's universal hospitality gesture. Burned bark and something else, always hot, always slightly wrong by registered space palette standards, always sufficient. She told him about the patient she'd lost to appendicitis 2 years ago because the surgical kit she'd had wasn't adequate, and she'd known it wasn't adequate and hadn't been able to do anything about that. He listened. He didn't offer perspective that wasn't asked for. She hadn't asked for perspective. She'd asked for a listener, and that was what the situation required. And he had learned slowly and at some cost the difference between the situation that required action and the situation that required presence, and how to be sufficient to the latter. He left her with a surgical kit from his own supplies. He had a spare, and she didn't, and the arithmetic was simple. 59 days in the Reach. He found a platform, unnamed, that had been running on a failing power cell for 6 months. He spent 3 days helping the platform's 3-person technical team, none of them engineers by any formal definition, all of them engineers by every practical one, implement a repair that bought them another 2 years before they'd need to replace the cell entirely. He found a settlement called the Threshold that was in the early stages of the kind of internal governance crisis that all communities in the Reach eventually faced. The period when the informal trust-based arrangements that worked at small scale began to fracture under population growth and resource pressure. He spent a week there, not resolving the crisis. That wasn't his function, and he had no authority to resolve it for them, but facilitating the specific conversations that needed to happen between the specific people who needed to have them, which turned out to be what they actually needed rather than resolution. He'd done this work in registered space many times. It was the same work. People were the same work everywhere, which was simultaneously the most complicated and the most manageable truth of his professional life. He was 73 days in the Reach when the Kethvorath came back, not to the congregation this time, to the beacon. He picked up their drive signature on his sensors while he was in transit between the unnamed platform and Dust Bowl 7, and he adjusted course, and he came to the beacon to find one Kethvorath vessel holding position relative to it, not transmitting, not moving, just present, watching the beacon broadcast. He held his own position at a respectful distance and broadcast on the frequency he'd established in the corridor. Exchange, repeating the limited gestural language patterns they'd developed over 3 hours, and 22 additional days of asymmetric learning. He held position for 6 hours. On the 6th hour, a transmission came. Not the structure as content form of the first message, something more developed. Something that used the coordinate embedding approach from the first message, but with additional layers, additional information density. He spent most of the following day on it and arrived at 3 things he was reasonably confident about. First, they had the 11 people from Lanak's family's contact information, relayed through the network he'd been building, and they were using it to communicate with Paolo specifically. Second, they had been in contact with the survey vessel he'd directed toward Tem Vargo's frequency. Third, they had a message for him. He worked on it for a further 4 hours and eventually understood it as a question about the beacon, about what the specific claim of enforcement active meant in terms of their approach to the Reach, about whether the beacon was a warning to leave or an invitation to engage under terms. He sat with that for a long time. It was both things, he thought. That was the honest answer, and the only answer that would serve the long term. It was a warning against approach without notice, and it was an invitation to approach with notice, and those 2 things existed simultaneously in the same function and couldn't be separated. The Reach contained 600 people in the Var Belt alone, and several thousand more in the broader unmapped expanse, and those people had lives and systems and adaptations built over decades, and the question of what a non-human presence in that space meant for those lives was a question that those people deserved to have a voice in, and his function was to ensure they had the time and the conditions to have that voice, rather than to answer the question on their behalf. He constructed a response. It took him several hours using everything the corridor exchange had built, plus everything the subsequent transmissions had added, working at the edge of his capacity to communicate in a language he didn't speak. He sent it. He held position and waited. The Kethvorath vessel responded after 4 hours. The response was brief and structurally clear enough that he was reasonably confident he understood it. It said, as closely as he could translate a communication form built on entirely different foundations into anything approaching a natural language rendering, something like, "We will contact before approach. We are learning the terms." He held that for a long time in the silence of his cockpit, with the stars outside and the beacon transmitting its steady broadcast into the dark. He sent back an acknowledgement. He flew to Dust Bowl 7. He verified the water reclamation unit and found it functional and properly sealed this time, and found that the food distribution processor had been recalibrated by Liz, who had apparently waited one day after his previous visit to recalibrate it herself without being asked, and had been running the proper allocations ever since without informing Peck, who had apparently chosen not to make an issue of it. He sat with the elderly woman he'd seen in the doorway on his first visit, who was named Vela, and who turned out to be 81 years old and to have been born in the Reach and to have lived her entire life in it, and who had more specific working knowledge of the Reach's history and conditions than anything in any official database. He sat with her for most of an afternoon and listened to everything she was willing to tell him, and what she was willing to tell him was considerable. He left with 3 hours of recordings on his signal processor that he would spend the following 2 weeks digesting and cross-referencing against his own observations. He went back to the navigation buoy. He stopped there each time he passed it now. He'd developed the habit of stopping, checking the beacon, adjusting as needed, spending a few minutes in the quiet of the area. Not because the buoy required regular attention, it was functioning well within its design parameters, but because the habit had meaning. The sign he'd passed when he first entered the Reach, "No law, 4,000 clicks," hand-painted by someone with strong feelings and poor penmanship, was gone. Someone had removed it. He didn't know when or who. In its place, the beacon broadcast its steady signal, "Marshall's Reach, enforcement active." Below that, in the coordinate data, contact frequencies, settlement locations, the specific architecture of a presence that was different from the presence registered space could offer, but was a presence, nonetheless. He pressed his hand against the buoy's hull for a moment. Cold metal in the cold dark, indifferent to whether he touched it. He took his hand away. He had work to do. He flew on, and the Reach stretched in all directions, and the people in it were going about the enormous, complicated business of being alive in a place that the rest of inhabited space had stopped. Looking at, and he was here, looking at it, present and specific and operational, with 41 years of understanding exactly what that meant and no intention of stopping. The badge was in his breast pocket. The note was next to it. The plate Grethy Sundell had given him was in his rucksack and weighed what it weighed, and he managed it. He keyed the next coordinates into his navigation system. He went. He found 2 new settlements within the next week that didn't appear on any chart, even Sadie's. The first was a cluster of 9 people who'd been living on a decommissioned research platform for 3 years without knowing anyone, was looking for them, not hiding, simply existing in a place too far from the main drift routes for anyone to have found them yet. They were fine, healthier than most, actually, having developed a remarkably effective hydroponic system out of salvaged components and 3 years of accumulated empirical knowledge. They knew nothing about the Kethvorath, he told them. He gave them the congregation's signal frequency and the new contact protocols. He left them with a map of the nearest 10 settlements, which they'd had no idea existed. The woman who seemed to be the effective center of the group, not designated, not elected, just the person everyone naturally oriented toward, which was the most functional kind of authority, shook his hand when he left, which was the first time anyone in the Reach had done that, and he noted it as a data point about regional variation in greeting customs, and was also, privately, glad of it. The second settlement was harder. It was a platform of 60 people who had, in the absence of any governance structure, and under the cumulative pressure of resource scarcity and 3 years of isolation, developed a set of internal arrangements that were. He looked at them with the practiced eye of someone who'd assessed community dynamics in stressed environments for 4 decades, about 4 months from producing something that would require serious intervention and significantly more resources than he had available. Not catastrophic yet, moving toward catastrophic. He spent 5 days there, doing the work that wasn't dramatic and wasn't documented and wasn't, in any language he knew how to use for official reporting, particularly easy to describe. Sitting with people, separately and together, in the specific posture of someone who was there to understand before they were there to judge, and finding the places where the stress had accumulated into fixable misunderstandings rather than irreversible damage, and working on those. On the 5th day, 3 people who had not been in the same room for 6 months had a conversation. It lasted 4 hours. He left the platform to them and flew out without waiting to find out how it ended, because that wasn't his to know. He'd done his part. They'd do theirs. He was 89 days in the Reach when Paolo reached him on the signal network. Paolo, the engineer from Lanark Station, was at the congregation, had been since Katie had brought the 11 back. He'd stayed, which said something. People who'd been through what Paolo had been through sometimes found that the place they'd been taken back to felt more like home than the place they'd come from. He'd been in communication with the Keth Vorath, using the gesture-based exchange framework they'd developed together, extending it, building it into something more structured. He was, by his own assessment, not translating. He was building a pigeon, a functional shared communication system assembled from pieces of both. Architectures of meaning, neither of them, both of them, something new. He sent Katie a message with 32 specific observations about Vorath communication patterns, each observation precise and carefully evidenced, and the last line of the message read, "They've asked about you specifically. I think the word they have for you is something like, the one who puts things in the floor." Cade read that in the cockpit of his shuttle, with the stars outside, and held very still for a moment with something he didn't try to name because he didn't have a word for it either. He wrote back, "Tell them, I am the one who goes where there is work to do. Tell them the work continues." He sent it. He filed the exchange in his signal processor's local memory under First Contact Protocol's VAR belt because the habit of documentation remained regardless of whether there was anywhere to send the documentation, and because the habit was not merely procedural, it was the insistence that what happened here was real, that it counted, that it was worth the record. He had been writing incident reports for 41 years. He would write them for the rest of whatever he was doing out here. He flew on. There were 94 days of this, and 95, and 112. There were settlements that improved and settlements that didn't, and a handful of situations that required the coil arm, and the long barrel rifle, and the specific controlled physicality of a man who'd been using his body as a tool for 4 decades. And there were many more that required only presence and attention, and the willingness to stay in a difficult room until the room changed. He lost 3 charge cells to a hull breach in the belt's deep interference zone, which was a problem he solved by trading 2 hours of his time, diagnosing and fixing a water processor issue at a small platform for 3 cells from the platform's spare inventory. He had a conversation with Greth Sundell once every 10 days approximately, through the signal network, in which she told him one thing about the congregation's current state, and he told her one thing about the broader Reach conditions, and neither of them said anything that wasn't necessary, which made the conversations brief and entirely sufficient. He thought about Vera Onuora sometimes in the long transits. He thought about what she'd known when she'd told him about the long walk option, the specific quality of knowing that lives, in the way you say something simply, without weight, without performance. She had known that this was his work, not his assignment, not his sentence, not his honorable retirement, his work, the thing he was. He had known it too in the moment she said it and had gone toward it with the clarity that only comes from alignment between what you are and what you're doing. He had not been as good at everything out here as he'd been at the things he'd been doing for 41 years. He'd been better at some things. He'd been sufficient to all of it, which was the word he'd always preferred over brilliant or exceptional or any of the other words that lived in the register of performance rather than the register of being. He was 120 days in the Reach when he went back to the midpoint boundary, not because he was leaving. He had no intention of leaving. He went back because Sadie Drum had asked him to, for reasons she'd stated as logistical. She had updated drift charts that were too large to transmit efficiently over the signal network, and he suspected also for reasons she hadn't stated, which was fine. He had developed a working relationship with Sadie Drum's reasons for doing things, which was, they were usually several things at once and always grounded in something real. The decommissioned buoy was where it had always been. He docked to Sadie's platform, got the drift charts, ate an actual meal. Sadie cooked in the specific way of people who'd learned to cook from necessity and found it became something else over time, and stayed the night. In the morning, she walked with him back to the docking bay, which was unusual. She stood in the bay while he prepped the shuttle. "The agency contacted me," she said, 2 days ago. First time anyone from registered space has used my frequency in years. He looked at her. What did they want? They wanted to know about you, where you were, whether you were operational. She had her arms crossed, her weight on her back foot. They have other marshals who want to do long walks. They want to know if it's viable. He turned back to the shuttle prep. What did you tell them? I told them to ask you themselves if they wanted to know. She paused. And I told them you were operational. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what that meant. Other marshals, other long walks, the possibility of a network in the Reach that was more than one man with a rucksack. He thought about what it would change and what it wouldn't. He thought about Dust Bowl 7 and the New Harbor Assembly and the unnamed platform with the hydroponic system and the 60 people on the platform who'd needed 5 days of a specific kind of attention and had gotten it. He thought about Paulo's message, the one who puts things in the floor. Tell them, he said, that the work is viable. Tell them the Reach needs people who are willing to go where there's no support structure. Tell them, he stopped. Tell them what? He thought about the right words for a moment. He thought about Cala Ress's note, which was still in his breast pocket, which would remain in his pocket for as long as there was a breast pocket. Tell them that the Reach is full of people who have been doing the work of holding things together for a long time without any acknowledgement that the work was real or that it counted, he said. Tell them that the first thing a marshal does here isn't enforce anything, it's show up. Tell them it's the showing up that matters first. Sadie looked at him for a moment. You could tell them yourself. I'll be in the VAR belt. She smiled. It was small and it was genuine, and it didn't live only in the lower part of her face, which was the difference. Go, she said. He went. He passed the midpoint boundary buoy on his way back, his beacon still transmitting steady and clear. Marshals Reach, enforcement active. Contact frequencies, settlement coordinates, the architecture of presence in a place that had been told for 20 years that it was beyond the reach of any such thing. He didn't stop this time. He knew what it said. He'd written it. He flew in, past the buoy, past the boundary between the place where the records said law existed and the place where the records said it didn't. And the stars didn't change when he crossed it, and the dark was the same dark on both sides. And what was different was only what he carried with him, which was 41 years and one badge and one note and one folded photograph he still hadn't looked at, and the specific, settled, operational certainty that he was precisely where he was supposed to be, doing precisely what he was supposed to be doing, and that there was a great deal more of it to do. He keyed the congregation's approach frequency. Tem, he said, I'm coming back through. Anything need attention? Her voice came back on the channel with the quality of someone who had been expecting the call and was glad of it. 3 things, none critical. Glad you're passing through. I'll be there in 14 hours, he said. We'll have food, she said. He flew on into the Reach, which was not a wasteland and had never been a wasteland, and the people in it were alive and building and failing and recovering and being human in the specific way of people who had no other option and had made that into something worth the name. He was here. He was the marshal who had come when no marshal was supposed to come, and had stayed when staying had no guarantee, and would stay until there was no him left to stay. The badge was in his breast pocket. He had work to do.